The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, afternoon, and evening, wherever you are. We're glad that you were able to join us for today's presentation of some of the highlights of this year's edition of the Global EV Outlook. The format for today's webinar is as follows. First, the main authors of the report will provide an overview of the main topics and themes covered in each chapter. I'll introduce each of them as they pass the baton from one to the next. Then at the end, I'll do my best to curate from the questions you ask and pose them to the relevant author. So please do feel free to ask any questions that might come up during the webinar. We'll start now with Gorner, who heads our team's work on EVs and who coordinated the analysis and the production of this report. Marine will begin by introducing the Electric Vehicles Initiative before she dives into a summary of the first chapter of the report, which focuses on EV market and policy trends over the past decade.
Thank you, Jacob. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. So I want to start with a short introduction on the context of the production of the Global EV Outlook publication. This was produced in the context of the Clean Energy Ministerial's Electric Vehicles Initiative, which the IEA coordinates since 2010. And which is a policy forum of 13 member countries, plus a number of partner organizations and other stakeholders. Via this initiative, a number of activities are implemented. One of the main ones is obviously the analysis with the production of the annual Global EV Outlook series. But also the collective commitments from the countries and their partners, such as, for example, the EV 30 at 30 campaign, and finally, a number of collaborative projects. But I will right now dive in to the content of the Global EV Outlook 2020 with this first presentation. Here I'll cover the evolution of the electric mobility market over the past decade until 2019, and even some insights to early 2020. So over the 2010 decade, the number of electric cars on the road have been expanding very rapidly. In 2019, they reached a total stock of 7.2 million electric cars around the world. This is a market that is still quite concentrated around three main markets, which are also key automotive markets. And these are China, European countries, and the United States. In addition to those 7.2 million electric cars, our estimates is for about 25,000 fuel cell electric vehicles on the road in 2019, and this combines cars, buses, and trucks. The deployment of charging infrastructure obviously accompanied this electric vehicle uptake. In 2019 in particular, it has seen in some regions actually a faster deployment than electric cars themselves, thanks to the accelerated deployment of publicly accessible chargers. When looking into sales, in 2019, electric car sales were about 2.1 million electric cars. This is quite stable. This is a small growth from 2018, plus 6%, while the annual growth of electric vehicle sales used to be much higher, actually, in previous years. So there have been increasing sales in Europe, somewhat stagnating in China, and a little drop in the US after a spike in sales actually in 2018. And overall market shares kept growing in most markets and attained 2.6% in 2019, which has never been that high. So we see three main drivers for these 2019 trends in terms of EV sales. The first one is that car markets contract, and 2019 has seen lower car sales in key markets than in 2018 or previously. Purchase subsidies have been also partially cut in some key markets. This happened, for example, in 2019 in China, also in the United States, where subsidies are given on a per automaker basis to the limit of a quota, and key OEMs such as GM, for example, or Tesla hit their quota in 2019. These cuts in subsidies are parts generally of planned transition from subsidies to other forms of policies in those markets. And finally, consumers are placed in a very odd position just at the entry of mass market transition, when actually a large offer of EV models have been announced for the next 5 years, about 200 models, some to come online as early as by the end of this year, 2021, in particular in the popular SUV segment. So consumers might be perhaps waiting actually for these new models, and for prices and battery prices in particular to continue dropping before actually moving on with their purchase. In other modes, electrification continues. China leads in all those modes, just as like in the car segment. So we estimate about 350 million electric 2- and 3-wheelers worldwide, the vast majority being in China, and a few 100,000 light commercial vehicles, buses, and a few dozen trucks as well. Obviously, as you may imagine, the electrification of the heavy-duty vehicles and the longest distance vehicles is a little bit more difficult to achieve than on cars and 2-wheelers, explaining in part these lower numbers to date. But there seems to be a momentum going on. And when looking at buses more particularly, this 2020 edition of the Global EV Outlook was actually the opportunity for us to work in collaboration with 4 cities across the world who deployed electric bus projects, and understand from their projects and their case studies what specific characteristics and lessons learned one can draw from their implementation. So those 4 cities are Helsinki in Finland, Santiago de Chile, Shenzhen in China, and Kolkata in India. And actually, the individual case studies are available on the webpage of the Global EV Outlook 2020. So you can look at the details there. And in the publication, we compiled and discussed these projects. What this showed us essentially is that electric bus systems around the world are all very unique and have their own very specific circumstances, not least, for example, into how they approach charging infrastructure and what charging infrastructure strategy is best adapted to them. For some of these cities, especially when the deployment dates back to a few years, like Shenzhen in China already, where volumes of these electric buses were still low, purchase subsidies were instrumental to bring these projects to life and to support the purchase of the vehicles. But this wasn't necessarily the case in all the projects. What's for sure is that in all the projects, a very close cooperation between different stakeholders, between the many stakeholders that operate electric buses was key. So here we're talking about the operators, energy companies who are in charge of charging infrastructure, for example, the public sector, and the manufacturers of the buses as well. So looking at policies a little bit for the second part of this presentation, over the entire 2010 decade up to 2019, EV policies obviously evolved and expanded and are adapting. And then in particular, they're adapting to make the transition to the next 2020 decade and more mass adoption. So up until now, EV subsidies and other purchase incentives have been really instrumental in driving EV adoption in literally all main EV markets. These purchase incentives that look at essentially lowering the purchase cost of EVs that is still higher than conventional counterparts. These are present at the moment in nearly all markets, and they have been driving the success of EVs in many of these countries. These can not only be in the form of direct subsidies, but also more detailed or more complex mechanisms such as fee-based or differentiated taxation that can also try to have more of a revenue neutral impact on the governments deploying them. But now, turning to the 2020 decade, we believe that it's more structural and regulatory policies that will drive EV adoption and will accompany this mass market transition via, in particular, stringent fuel economy regulations that exist, for example, in the European Union, but also EV mandates that exist already in China, for example, and also in the state of California with a few other US states. This aims at giving a strong long-term signal to the industry to prepare and adapt, as well as transitioning in a way that is sustainably, economically viable for governments. The policy portfolios also continue to diversify, looking more and more at the batteries, at building a strong infrastructure, charging infrastructure network, at EV grid integration, etc. So as of 2019, we counted 17 countries actually that have voiced ambitions to completely phase out conventional car sales or implement 100% EV sales in timeframes that vary between 2025 and 2050. And France in December 2019 was the first country to put this intention in law, actually, in its orientation for mobility law. Finally, a last word about COVID-19 impacts that we can observe to date and early policy responses that have been given. Obviously, as all of you know, the first 4 months of 2020 saw an unprecedented drop in global car sales, and this hit electric car sales as well. But there are signs that that specific sector may be more resilient, at least in some markets, such as China and Europe, than the overall car market. Many uncertainties remain for the future, not least for the last 6 months of 2020, how the pandemic will develop, the pace of economic recovery, behavioral changes potentially coming from COVID-19 with maybe increased car use, impact of low oil prices on EV purchase. But what we observe to date is that for the moment, no significant EV policy rollback has been announced by key markets, and major automotive industry players reaffirmed their commitments to their EV plans. So our outlook to the end of 2020 remains quite optimistic for electric cars, with sales range about the same as in 2019, or even a little bit more, and with a strong market share around about 3%. So now we'll pass on to the next presentation, and thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Sorry. So globally, the outlook expects explores the future development of electric mobility through two scenarios. The first one is the stated policy scenario, which aims at reflecting the impact of announced policy measures and officially declared regulation. The second scenario is the sustainable development scenario, which rests on three pillars. The first one is universal energy access, second, the reduction of air pollution, and third, the fulfillment of climate change goals of the Paris Agreement. The sustainable development scenario also includes the goals of the countries that signed the EV30 at 30 campaign, which aim at achieving collectively 30% market share of EVs across all modes except for 2 and 3-wheelers by 2030. In the stated policy scenario, the EV fleet across all modes grows from approximately 8 million at the end of 2019 to 50 million in 2025 and 140 million by 2030. Please bear in mind that these numbers do not include 2 and 3-wheelers and that they do not take into account the COVID-19 assumptions. In 2030, EVs account for approximately 7% of the global vehicle fleet, and more than 90% of the total EV fleet is constituted by light-duty vehicles. In the sustainable development scenario, the global EV fleet is projected to grow even further, reaching 80 million in 2025 and 245 million by 2030. Regarding the regional dimension of the EV deployment, we see that until 2030, in both scenarios, it's China that retains the lead in the absolute number of electric vehicles circulating, and China is then followed by Europe. The rollout of electric vehicle charging infrastructure proceeds side by side to the deployment of electric vehicles, and the number of private chargers for light-duty vehicles and dedicated chargers for bus and trucks expand to 135 million in the stated policy scenario and 240 million in the sustainable development scenario, with the number of light-duty vehicle chargers largely outnumbering those for buses and trucks. And on the right, you can see that also publicly accessible chargers for light-duty vehicles are seen to expand, even if reaching much lower levels than those of private chargers. And in particular, it's interesting to observe that in both scenarios in 2030, approximately 90% of the total publicly accessible chargers are slow chargers. The growing EV fleet also implies an increasing consumption of electricity from the road transport sector. Electricity demand from the green EVs rose from 80 terawatt-hour in 2019 to about 550 terawatt-hour in 2030 under the stated policy scenario, and 1,000 terawatt-hour in the sustainable development scenario. As of today, electric vehicles account only for a minor fraction of the global total final electricity consumption, approximately 0.5%. However, we estimate that by 2030, electric vehicles are likely to play an important role for the power system. And it is important to ensure that their uptake does not create issues to the operation of the power system, as my colleague Thibaut will explain soon. In this regard, I think it's interesting to observe in this second figure that slow chargers, which are those here indicated in bluish colors, that slow chargers are estimated to account for about 60% of the total electricity consumed from electric vehicles. And while consuming electricity, electric vehicles avoid the consumption of oil products. In 2030, the global EV fleet will displace about 2.5 million barrels per day of oil in the stated policy scenario, and approximately 4.2 million barrels per day under the sustainable development scenario. Regarding the greenhouse gas emissions, we estimate that in 2019, the global EV fleet emitted about 50 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which you can see here on the positive side, the positive axis. However, this is about half the amount that would have been emitted if the same vehicle fleet was composed of internal combustion engines. And this results in approximately 53 million tons of CO2 equivalent of avoided emissions, which are represented by this red dot here. By 2030, greenhouse gas emission from the EV fleet become about 4 times larger in the steps compared to 2019. And if the EV stock was instead constituted by internal combustion engines, emission would have been almost twice as much, about 400 megatons of CO2. Finally, in the SDS, which assumes a faster decarbonization of the power generation, we see that emissions generated by the circulating EV fleet in 2030 remain approximately at the same levels as in the step scenario, despite the uptake of EVs is much larger, as we see before. And this suggests that to fully untap the climate change mitigation potential of electric vehicles, it is crucial to further reduce the CO2 intensity of power generation. I'm now leaving the floor to my colleague Leonardo.
Yeah, now Leonardo Paoli, who has focused on battery performance, cost, and chemistries, will outline the growth in battery capacity that's implied by each of these two scenarios and introduce a few of the potential new battery chemistries for electromobility that might emerge after 2030. I know that some people are having slight audio issues and questions are starting to come in, so we'd encourage you to please, now that we've gotten through a bit of the presentation, any questions that might come to mind, please do feel free to write those in the question box.
Thank you very much, Jacob. I will talk about battery demand projections and technologies. So we estimated that the demand for batteries in transport application in 2019 was around 125 gigawatt hours and 125 gigawatt hours per year, with around 100 of these coming from light duty application. When we look out to 2030, we estimate that battery capacity would reach 1,500 gigawatt hours per year in the stated policy scenarios. On the other hand, when we consider our sustainable development scenario, battery demand would be twice as much at around 3,000 gigawatt hours per year. As you can see from the slide, the vast majority of battery demand is expected to be driven by pure electric light-duty vehicles. That is 90% in the stated policy scenarios and 80% in the sustainable development scenario. This vast increase in battery demand has consequences on the requirements for critical battery materials. In particular, in this edition, we have focused on nickel, cobalt, lithium, and manganese. Demand for nickel and cobalt has a higher uncertainty because their demand will depend also on cathode technologies, on those cathode technologies that will dominate over the next decade. On the other hand, demand for lithium is expected to follow demand for batteries rather linearly, as there are no current substitutes for lithium, at least within the 2030 timeframe. This brings me on to the next slide. So we see in 2019 a doubling of the high nickel content cathodes compared to 2018. By high nickel content, I include NMC 622 and NMC 811. However, the share of LFP has more or less halved over this period. We do believe that in the next 10 years, lithium-ion technology will remain dominant. However, it will not be long until we hit the practical limits of lithium-ion chemistries, especially in terms of energy density. We estimated using the software backpack that such limit would be reached at around 325 watt-hours per kilogram at a cell level. Therefore, in the longer term, we expect other technology to be likely to take over lithium-ion market share, at least for some applications. In this slide, you can see some of the salient technologies that might take over lithium-ion, and they all have advantages and disadvantages compared to the current technology. However, especially in terms of energy density, we see that lithium metal solid-state batteries do have significant advantages compared to lithium-ion, and therefore are likely to become important over the next, let's say, in the decade after 2030. I think now we'll give the word back to my colleagues.
Yeah, and now we'll hear again from Maureen, who will focus on the sustainability, economic, and emissions implications of battery supply chains, here focusing in particular on end-of-life considerations.
Okay, thank you, Jacob. So in the continuation of the work done in the Global EV Outlook 2019, on life cycle emissions of various powertrains and EVs in general, of the discussion on raw and critical materials that we've had. This year, we updated slightly this life cycle impacts analysis and decided to look more in detail on the end-of-life aspects of batteries, which was not covered in the Global EV Outlook 2019. So to start with, what we observe is that today, under current conditions and looking at theoretical illustration, taking into account a global average vehicle size with global average fuel economy, with global average intensity of electricity generation, we do see that electric vehicles and alternative powertrains do bring benefits in comparison to conventional cars. The main message that I want to bring here, and in particular through this figure, is that for all these powertrains, actually the main potential area for decarbonizing these powertrains over the life cycle is actually the use phase, that is represented by the orange and yellow colors of the graph. So in particular, when it comes to electric vehicles, decarbonizing the use phase and the electricity generation in the countries of use is a high priority. Now, as this happens, and as the electricity generation on the use phase gradually decarbonizes, the emissions coming from other aspects of the life cycle of the vehicles will necessarily gain in importance. And there, in particular, the battery life cycle and battery manufacturing, in particular, will become more and more important. In particular, as the size of these batteries continue growing, and in the specific cases when the batteries are manufactured in places with carbon-intensive energy sources for heat and for electricity. So at their end of life, electric, so we estimate that by 2030, there's going to start to be certain volumes of lithium-ion batteries that will be retired from the automotive sector. This is our outlook to 2030. This is about 100 gigawatt-hour per year of retired batteries by 2030, which is about similar to current battery production, actually. And then we'll raise the question of what to do with the end of life of these batteries. Obviously, one aspect that is very discussed and debated at the moment is the relevance of reusing these batteries for a second life and extending their lifetime, essentially. And so there are opportunities coming from second life applications, but also challenges. So clearly, reusing automotive batteries for stationary storage in second life can help providing grid services and extend the lifetime of these batteries, and therefore reduce the embodied emissions of these batteries per kilowatt hour without having to manufacture new specific batteries. However, there are a few challenges coming in this sort of nascent market. First of all is the dynamic battery technology and cost environment. So these, as Leo pointed out earlier, the battery chemistries, technologies are evolving rapidly, the costs are dropping rapidly. So there's a key question into knowing whether by 2030, those batteries which will be retired from automotive applications will be cost competitive with new batteries that can be manufactured by then. Also, preparing the batteries for second life application is not necessarily a completely straightforward process. It's actually a multi-steps refurbishing process involving different stakeholders, involving to transfer the battery between one stakeholder and the other, and understanding its state of health, understanding where it needs fixes, etc., before being able to provide the second life applications. So in all that process, technical information transfer is key and is lacking at the moment from the early experiences from second life applications that we can see. For example, on what the battery technology is, what's inside of it, actually, what's its state of health, etc. So looking at other pathways to actually decarbonize and reduce the impact of batteries over their life cycle, there are a few other ways to do this that can or not involve second life. The first one is to reduce battery manufacturing emissions. And to do so, we suggest mainly two main avenues. One is economies of scale, as manufacturing plants continue growing, higher throughput plants as well that allow to gain energy efficiency in these plants, and also energy sources into manufacturing that are decarbonized from both electricity and heat. And already these two measures can provide significant GHG emissions reductions from manufacturing the batteries. Then at end of life comes recycling, and recycling is a key topic from now to the next decade. By recovering critical materials, a robust recycling system would reduce end demand for raw materials and GHG emissions and alleviate local impacts from mining and refining. What we observe today, studies suggest that current mainstream recycling technologies have a limited impact on reducing life cycle emissions from batteries, because these technologies are energy intensive technologies. But looking into the future, there's also innovation going on, looking at new processes that are maybe less invasive, that won't require to break down the materials to the single individual material before manufacturing a new battery. That may in the future actually also reduce the GHG emissions from recycling. When looking at other environmental impacts from batteries, studies suggest that from recycling, other studies suggest that there's a very positive outlook there on the benefits of recycling on the environmental impacts of batteries. Finally, so around this topic of end of life, waste management, batteries, recycling, there's a dynamic policy environment. One of the key things that we observed through our analysis is that actually many of the existing national and regional policies for battery waste management and for recycling were put in place actually before EV markets existed, and are therefore not adapted to automotive lithium-ion batteries. So there's a need to adapt policies there to aim at specific critical materials, to adapt collection systems, and these sort of things. And so key regions are already moving on that front. China has recently produced extensive new legislation regarding end of life and recycling of batteries, and for example, the European Union is also in the process of assessing its battery directive and planning for revision to adapt it to the electric vehicle industry. The economic value of recycling is uncertain to date, and also potentially in the future. For now, because of quite low volumes to recycle, but also in the future because of potentially fluctuating raw materials prices. So there's a role for policy there to reduce this uncertainty. And And in addition to the environmental benefits from recycling, which government may want to reap via their policies, the economic and strategic value of critical materials may actually incentivize recycling in the long term and actually steer recycling policies. So just to finish, a transparent materials value chain that involves all stakeholders along the value chain will be key to ensure battery traceability and its sustainability over the life cycle of the battery. And their effective information flow is really key. So this can start with super simple measures, such as, for example, labeling the battery technology and chemistry on the battery for the information of the second life refurbishers, for example, or the recyclers, to working towards absolutely transparent reporting and accounting of the raw materials flows from the mining to the battery manufacturing plant and to the electric vehicle plant.
Thanks, Marine. So the last focus of the publication was the nexus between EVs and power systems for two main reasons. The first one, looking at the trend to 2030, is that EVs account for 0.3% of global electricity use today. But in 2030, it will be actually 4% in the Sustainable Development Scenario that Jacopo presented. So how EV charging will impact the load curve is a question to ask for 2030. The second reason for which we're interested in this topic is the rise of renewables, which create a lot of variability in power supply. Yet in EVs, there are a lot of battery storage capacity that can be tapped into to provide flexibility services to the grid. And we'll go through these different services by degree of ambition in this presentation. So first, to introduce the topic, we'll look at a typical weekday unmanaged load profile for electric vehicles, and we realize that there is a large peak during nighttime. It's mainly driven by PLDVs, who account for 60% of total energy use among electric vehicles, basically because when people come back home from commuting, they charge their EVs. And the thing is that this charging can happen right after coming back home or later through the night, so we could exploit a potential delay in the charging in the night. Actually, studies have shown that 80 to 90% of PLGV charging occurs at night in the EU and the United States. The contribution of other modes is also significant when added together because they represent 40% of the total energy consumed by electric vehicles. And especially buses and trucks can mostly charge at depots, so at night, especially for buses. I mean, only 10 or 30% of charging occurs during daytime. There is an opportunity also for LCVs of work-based charging that can distribute a little bit more the EV charging through the day. But globally, we realize that there is a wide evening peak in general that needs to be addressed. That shifting it to the night through, for example, static off-peak tariffs could help alleviate the contribution of EVs to the grid, to the peak power. And here is the results in the night charging case, for example, where actually the contribution of EVs to peak demand is reduced by 60% in the main markets, so China, India, the US, European Union. And we see that most of this drop is driven by PLDVs, and that actually EVs in the night charging case, so charging after midnight typically, contribute to less than 2% of the peak demand in our Sustainable Development Scenario in 2030. Additional potential could be tapped into through controlled charging, further optimizing the charging, for example, through V1G, what we call controlled charging. But it's not the only services that V1G can provide. Indeed, when we look at the global load curve ahead of today, so in 2040, for example, so this is taken from our colleagues from the World Energy Outlook, we realize that changing power system operation will create new business opportunities for electric vehicles. So not only we can mitigate the impact of EVs to the peak demand, but we can also provide more services. Basically, through two different things. The first one is taking advantage of the renewables that are in the grid during daytime, and in particular solar, in both markets, actually, the European Union, the United States, China, and India, typically from 11 to 4 p.m. Through V1G, so controlled charging, with price signals from the grid that says that a lot of renewable energy is available. Element of revenues for EV owners that will add value to the fact that they will only charge at times during which renewables are in the grid, for example, for guarantees of origin. In 2040, we also see a significant peak in the evening that is even more emphasized by the rise of different appliances, especially space cooling, for example, so a shift to electric cooking, and that we wouldn't want electric vehicles to be charging and to be drawing electricity during this period. But on the contrary, through vehicle to grid, we could imagine that they would be able to supply for electricity during these peak periods, and therefore being an active member on electricity markets to the smoothing of the curve, not only during the day for variable renewables, but throughout the day and the night. And so this is a significant additional opportunity that could be tapped into. There is really a lot of energy capacity in electric vehicles already in 2030. We're talking about 1,600 gigawatt hours, but of course not all of this capacity is available. So we need to quantify what's a realistic share of the total EV battery capacity that could be available for flexibility services. And I focus here on V2G and peak shaving. So here in green, you have for the moment the battery capacity that is available in all the modes, so PLDVs, LCVs, 2 and 3 wheelers. And we'll start by checking out, for example, the capacity used for transportation. Also, the capacity that can remain unexploited to preserve the battery lifetime, and also the capacity that can be discharged during an event when, for example, the TSO or the ISO calls for an event when we need some supply from electric vehicles. And we realize that this capacity is actually shrinking. So for transportation, it's around 50% that is lost for PLDVs because when people come back home at night, they've used a little bit of their battery for transportation. For LCVs, this share is much higher. It's around 40% because of a greater use of an LCVs during the day operations. And managed to narrow down the energy storage capacity that could be used for flexibility services from a technical perspective. From a behavioral perspective, not all users will realistically contribute to flexibility services. And here again, we've made some assumptions on the participation rates. And here you can see what the resulting available, both from a technical and behavioral point of view, what share is available for flexibility. So here we've considered that between 25% and 35% of users, depending on markets, but also depending on the time of the day, if the event is extreme, for example, and the price difference between electricity grids, between electricity prices might be higher, of PLDV users who are actually participating. For LCVs, we assumed a larger share because LCV owner will own actually a fleet that will be able to provide even more flexibility because of the aggregated batteries of all across the fleet. So PLDVs and LCVs are the main contributors to V2G potential. So in short, we realized that only 5% of the global EV battery capacity could be available, but 5% of a large number is still a very large number. And when we try to compare this to the global need for power across these markets, so here, for example, you have the generation capacity. On the left side, you have peak capacity requirements. On the right side, you have off-peak capacity requirements. And we realized that globally, if we add up every market, we have a 50 gigawatt difference between off-peak and peak times. But on top of that, we should also add the difference of variable renewables that will be more available during off-peak time, that is during the day, just because of solar production, and mainly driven by solar production. And to this, we add a 400 gigawatt difference on top of the 500, so 900 gigawatt difference between peak capacity requirements and off-peak capacity requirements. And the contribution of vehicle to grids, assuming all the limitations we've already described in the previous slide, could actually be 600 gigawatts. So it's really not negligible. It's actually a wide role that EVs could play in maintaining grid flexibility and grid stability, because 60 gigawatts represents nearly half of the current hydropower capacity, and that's only by 2030. So as the number of EVs continue to grow in 2035, 2040, this potential could only grow. So as a conclusion, for this potential to be realized, we need to institute dynamic electricity pricing, not only to enhance the integration of renewables and reflect the fact that a lot of renewables are available in the grid at a given period of time, but also to reduce the contribution of EVs to EV charging to peak power, and even make them contribute to actually supply for electricity through vehicle to grid or vehicle to home, depending on the business model during this time. Investing on V1G and V2G infrastructure is the second key recommendation, as well as developing softwares to promote end-user engagements and make them aware of these potential revenue streams across different modes, especially from PLDVs and LCVs. With that, I thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the overall webinar, and I'll hand it over to Jacob for the Q&A session.
Thanks, Thibaut. So a number of questions have come in, and I'd like to start, I guess, with the questions about the regional disaggregation that the report goes into, and some of the data questions. There are questions about the greenhouse gas emissions, both in the base year and then the evolution of the greenhouse gas emissions attributed to electric vehicles versus ICEs on a well-to-wheels basis. And maybe Jacopo, if you could first start by addressing what are the regions that account for most of the greenhouse gas emissions attributable to EVs right now, and then how do we project forward the well-to-wheels greenhouse gas emissions in each of the scenarios? And also, if you could say a word about the data that's given in the annexes to the report, that'd be great. Thanks.
Sure, thanks for this question. So in terms of today, as you can see in the figure that we have shown, the majority of emissions from the electric vehicle fleet come from 2- and 3-wheelers. They account for approximately 50% of the total greenhouse gas emissions today. And the large majority of this fleet, of this 2-wheeler fleet, is located in China. So as of today, this is the region where there is the largest EV fleet, as Marine described at the very beginning, and therefore it's responsible for the lion's share of the total emissions. In terms of forward projections, what we do is that we consider the variations in fuel economy of electric vehicles, both for battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid, also changes in the way that plug-in hybrids are used in terms of usage of the electric driving rather than the usage of internal combustion engines. And it's very important, we also take into account the variation in the carbon intensity of the power grid in the different countries. So we do this analysis country to country, distinguishing between the different countries. Then the results are aggregated, but we have these insights. And to calculate also the avoid the greenhouse gas emissions, we of course calculate also the greenhouse gas emissions from the internal combustion engine equivalent fleet. And here we take into account improvements of fuel economy, and also we take into account the penetration of biofuels, for instance, of renewable ethanol and biodiesel. I hope this answers the question, yeah?
Yeah, and just to highlight the fact that the carbon intensity of electricity generation in each of the regions is evolving along the steps that are along the trajectories that are modeled for the sustainable development scenario and the stated policy scenario at a country level. So that also is going to influence the trajectory of the well-to-wheel greenhouse gas emissions, of course, attributable to the electric vehicles. And that's average annual carbon intensity of electricity generation, including also T&D losses and losses coming from charging the vehicles. Another question that I see here is, there's a lot of news articles coming out about the potential impacts of the COVID crisis on the EV market and on the car market. Some of these come from supply bottlenecks. Some of these come from the sheer fact that when countries are on lockdown, nobody is buying cars. And others might have to do with behavioral changes that come as a result of what various societies are going through. I wonder, Maureen, I know this is something that we focused on a bit also in the report. If you could try to address this question, what are some of the potential impacts coming out of COVID for the adoption of electric vehicles?
Yes, sure. Thank you for the question. So in the Outlook chapter, although our two scenarios don't take into account long-term impacts of COVID as such, we tried to explore in a box. It's really just an exploration looking into what could be drivers stemming from COVID-19 that could have an impact on the 2030 electric mobility landscape. And so there, essentially, we identified drivers that go in opposite directions, and we allocated them to two kind of scenarios that we defined as the bright scenario for electric mobility and the more bleak scenario for electric mobility. From what we can see today, and if we imagine that these things continue having a long-term effect on our is really triggered for these local policymakers the possibility to actually consider changing things to remain going in that direction for the long term. So we hear more and more announcements of giving more space to non-car modes, of circulation or access restrictions for most polluting vehicles, etc. And going beyond the local policy level, we also see an opportunity for national governments and regional governments even to take advantage of to make it a tipping point and reinforcing even further the electric mobility ambitions and policies. And so under this bright scenario, we see electric vehicle uptake actually accelerating to 2030, getting to a level that doesn't quite reach the SDS yet, because the SDS requires a very well-structured and comprehensive policy portfolio with the regulations that we discussed before, etc. But that might help us approach these SDS goals. On the other hand, in the scenario, and this also takes from early experiences we have from the COVID crisis, we see that traffic aboard cars is picking up faster than on public transport. There might be a long-term effect of public transport avoidance from individuals. Actually, a few surveys have already indicated that lots of households actually are looking to buy a new car as a result of this. And if this combined with actually political rollback in the commitments to cleaner mobility because of economic reasons, for example, this really could delay the adoption of electric vehicles. So at the moment, we have these two possibilities that go in two different directions, and I think only the future will tell us which path we'll take, with the hopes that all the elements will be put in place to go towards the optimistic pathway.
Thanks, Marie. So another question that has come up quite a bit is about heavy-duty vehicles, trucks in particular. And indeed, there are some sections of the report that focus on trucks. We've seen a lot of progress recently, both in the model offer. There are an expanding number of trucks that are medium and heavy-duty vehicles that are being offered internationally, and there's some good work tracking that model offer being done by a partner of ours, CalStart, as part of their kind of data gathering efforts and the Drive to Zero campaign. About 22,000 medium and heavy-duty electric trucks have already been deployed in China, most of that since the year 2015 onwards, and there the market is growing very fast. Most of these heavy-duty vehicles are operating in cities and are taking advantage of some of the infrastructure, in particular in China, that's already been developed, say, for urban buses. But to expand the operational potential for electric trucks to things like regional and long-haul operations will require some policy effort. And there, among the world's first movers are California, where certain policies, including mandates for medium and heavy-duty ZEV mandates for medium heavy-duty vehicles and targets for zero-emission vehicles are being set up. Also, there's going to need to be increased attention on charging infrastructure. There's a question about what our projections are for heavy-duty vehicles, and there we've differentiated to the extent possible between urban operations, where the prospects for electrification are a lot nearer term and stronger, and these regional and long-haul operations. And indeed, we don't reach the sales shares that we get in the sustainable development scenario or the STEP scenario that we see for, say, light-duty vehicles, let alone 2- and 3-wheelers, but we reach shares of about 8% for heavy-duty vehicles on whole in the sustainable development scenario. And indeed, with sufficient policy push, this is the next frontier, as is being shown, I think, in China, for electrification, heavy-duty vehicles. So let me move on to another question then. This question refers to the potential for vehicle-to-grid that was shown to be estimated in the presentation by Thibaut at the end. And the question is, why is this potential for V2G so low, and what can be done to increase the availability rate of V2G? Thibaut, would you like to take a stab at that question? Sure, thanks.
So in the slide where we've tried to estimate the potential available for V2G, we've tried to be realistic regarding both the technical and the behavioral available potential. And this 5% is actually not low because we are talking about this amount of energy that is available when we actually need it. So when there is, for example, congestion in the grid across an entire market, and this is a 5% out of the total global EV battery capacity on board. So it's very high, and it can be translated when we look at the numbers regarding power availability. This 600 gigawatts of power availability out of an estimated 1,000 globally of flexibility needs. So that's quite significant. And then if we want to maintain or to increase this share, we would have to look at, first and foremost, increasing the discharging capacity of the chargers and dischargers. So, for example, installing 7 or 10 kilowatt chargers instead, for example, of very slow chargers for, in particular, for PLDV vehicles. We'd like also to do some more investigation regarding the effect of charging and discharging on the lifetime of battery electric vehicles. And this is for two main reasons. First, to increase the technical potential, because if we can tap into a larger share of the battery, then we'll have more potential. And the second, and to me most important reason, is also to make users confident that this will not affect the lifetime too much, or not at all, in fact. To be sure that actually this will only be a positive streams of revenue with no degradation regarding the battery. The last measure I would take to increase this potential would be to raise consumer awareness that this exists. I saw another question about whether this is available today, and yes, this is available today. We just need the right vehicle, so the ability of the onboard telematics to answer to different signals from the aggregator. We need to be able to work on a liberalized energy market to have some trading of electricity or of capacity that could be made. So we'll have to get all those regulatory requirements as well as the technical requirements regarding the capacity of discharging from the chargers and of the electric vehicles to take the information from the grid. But yes, this is available today.
Thanks, Thibaut. That's all the questions we have time for today, but I'd like to just highlight a couple of things. One is that many of the questions regarding data, there are these annexes at the end of the report where we give our both historical numbers for EV sales and stocks and our scenario projections in both the stated policy scenario and the SES. Second, there's a lot of interest and there are a lot of questions about the battery supply chains, not surprisingly. Some of the societal impacts, environmental impacts, the availability of critical materials. To the extent possible, we'll try to follow up, since we have a list of these questions, with the people who have asked them on a one-to-one basis. But I invite you, if you're interested in those kind of questions, not only to look at the chapter dealing with battery supply chains and focusing on end-of-life consideration in this year's GEVO, but also to take a look back at last year's GEVO, where there was more extensive discussion of those kind of issues. Thank you for your attendance, for your questions, for your time. We would like to point you to the report itself. It's got a lot more rich details than we were able to convey today in just a little over an hour. And we hope that you find value in our report. There's been a tremendous amount of effort on our team, and in particular from Marine, to put this together and to make sure that it accurately reflects changes that have happened over the past year. Thanks again.